engineering, genetic engineering, and the limits and so forth of that. So the topic of our debate today is there a limit to genetic engineering? Over the last week or so, and the Easter holidays, our AP students have been investigating different sides of the argument, either for or against. Some would argue that genetic engineering needs to be restricted, needs to be limited, because it's just too dangerous. Others would argue that perhaps limiting genetic engineering just stymies the race towards something greater and better. Today's argument hopefully will delve into both sides of that story. And we have two very good teams here. In the for team, we have Oliver Branham Upton, Chris Cagliuso, and Donovan Wu. And they will be, for those of you who don't know who they are, they'll be in the maroon sweaters or shirts. And in the against team, we have Brian McGinn, Tom Skozik, and Sal Genovese. They'll be wearing blue. So they will be easy to recognize. Oh, okay. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask everybody, please, how it's going to work today is basically we will alternate. So we'll have the for team, maroon, will start with their introduction, and then we'll go back to the against team, the blue team, with their introduction, then to the body on both sides, and then to the rebuttals for the maroon and then the blue team. And then I'll open it up to the floor, in other words, you all, so that you can interact and ask questions and, yeah, basically be part of this debate. I would ask you, however, to mute your microphones and close off your video tabs, and so we can get this going a little quicker. And only the speakers will be able to speak at the time. If you have a question when I open it up to the floor, please write in the chat session question for the blue team against or the maroon team for. And if you know their names, you can actually ask them directly. And then I will give a chance for that question to be answered. So I will moderate the whole debate. Okay. I hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, I'm going to open it up to our first speaker. It would be Oliver Branham Upton. All yours.
Okay. So my team members consist of myself, Chris Cagliuso doing the main argument, Donovan Wu, who's going to be doing the rebuttal and the conclusion. Genetic engineering involves the manipulation of an organism's genes through utilization of biotechnology. This means changing an organism's genome so that new DNA may be inserted into the host genome by getting a DNA sequence and then putting this into the host organism by use of a molecular biology vector. We believe that genetic engineering should be limited as it means maintaining an ethical and mindful regard for natural processes, organisms, and the economy. Specifically, use of genetic modification to remove genetic diseases is satisfactory. However, we deem cultivating populations of smarter people, different appearances, or any other cosmetic changes that won't necessarily save a person's life as unnecessary. It must also be made an available option. Additionally, the excessive implementation of genetic modification of crops can result in the deprivation of micronutrients to organisms that depend on those crops. Furthermore, the extreme rate at which producing GMO crops is being proposed by some will likely have a negative impact on the global economy as big businesses make local farmers more relevant. Our team is sure that we can all agree, like most other things relating to nature and the earth, moderation is key, especially in times plagued with serious changes in climate affecting biodiversity and populations of various species. We must remind ourselves of the vitality of using a science that would alter natural processes in a reserved manner. Okay.
Thank you, Oliver. I presume you're done. I didn't know if we got disconnected there. I'm going to presume you're done. Okay.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you, Oliver. I'm now going to turn over to Brian McGinn for the against team, the blue team, who will present his team and his introduction.
Hi, everyone. I'd just like to start by introducing my team. I will be doing the introduction. The main argument will be debuted by Thomas Skocek, and our conclusion and rebuttal by Sal Genovese. So now I'll start by what is genetic engineering. So it's important to address what it actually is and how it actually works in order for everyone to understand, and then we can address our argument as well. So genetic engineering is the modification of the characteristics of an organism by manipulating its genetic material. CRISPR-Cas9 editing is comprised of an enzyme Cas9 and other variants that binds an RNA molecule called the guide RNA or gRNA, whose sequence guides the complex to the matching genome sequence, allowing the Cas9 enzyme to introduce a double-strand break with the matching sequence. So in more basic terms, genetic engineering involves cutting out a piece of a certain piece of genetic code, which codes for different phenotypes or characteristics in a human being, like hair color, or in plants, like resistance to disease, nutritional value. It involves cutting out a portion of that and adding in a desired genome sequence, so that could characterize for a certain trait or desired outcome. So when asked the question, is there a limit to genetic engineering? The simple answer that our group has responded with is no. With genetic engineering, humans have the ability to solve environmental crises, food shortages, and nutritional deficiencies, and produce disease-resistant plants. Even more, humans could work to develop cures for human diseases, modify the genetic code to prevent inheritable diseases, and find a way to evolve the human race. Over years and years, millions of years, humans have slowly evolved, but now, in the more modern times, where scientific research has improved greatly and new discoveries have evolved, we see that we are at a lack of quote evolution. So now we believe that genetic engineering is this way to evolve the human race, to make them more resistant to different diseases and upcoming problems and other disasters that could affect the human race. Several benefits to genetic engineering include being able to modify humans to become resistant to different diseases and inheritable traits, increasing food production by modifying genetic makeups of plants and animals, and allowing more nutrition to be consumed within each food, such as rice, potatoes, and other foods that are very common but may lack appropriate nutrition for the hungry and those who don't have as ample of food as others. So now passing to that, now going into our argument, we will discuss different benefits and how, if genetic engineering is limited, we will be losing many of its great promises and many of the things that it could help the whole world. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Very well introduced there. Congratulations. We're going to now move over to, once again, to the 4 team, the maroon team, and we're going to hand over to Chris Cagliuso, who's going to present the body of the argument for the 4 team.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Norris, and thank you for everybody for joining. Once again, our group is in favor of limiting genetic engineering. And just going off of what Oliver said, our team is not totally against the idea of genetic engineering. And we, in fact, believe that there are possible benefits, such as mitigating certain diseases and cancers, as well as benefiting wildlife and nature. However, there are certain factors of allowing a full-blown scale of genetic engineering that thwart society's best interest, and going in a full-blown scale can actually have some disastrous effects. So there are three main reasons our team have outlined for limiting genetic engineering. The three are the morality, such as playing God, that common phrase, the access of genetic engineering, and the thin medical justifications for the studies. Okay, so going into the morality, again, our group is not necessarily against the fact of advancing science for the betterment of society. However, allowing this to go full scale can have bad effects. Okay, so playing God, we've all kind of heard this statement, but allowing parents and scientists to genetically maneuver around the DNA of certain humans will, such as designer babies, we've all heard that, genetically advancing them, making them more smarter, physically advanced, will just create a lack of diversity within society and will harm people who actually choose not to go forward within this process. Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson actually quoted and said, "We are about to abandon natural selection by moving on with this process, the process that created us, in order to direct our own evolution by volitional selection, which is the process of redesigning our own biology and human nature as we wish them to be." So he's kind of explaining how, we're all getting very excited about envisioning the whole future of humans and redesigning them, and it sounds great on paper. However, making these ideal humans will actually have terrible benefits to society and will, again, decrease diversity. And it really makes you think about how badly do we really want this, about the societal effect and the social effect. Adding on to that, the next point is the access of genetic engineering, which adds on to the designer baby point. The thought of giving access to every family to pursue genetic engineering of their own child is frankly unrealistic. A study done by Colby College actually explains that the demand for designer babies are rapidly growing, and they are actually putting price tags on eggs and fetuses of babies. So it's really an ethical problem, actually treating human life as objects. The Colby College study said that the price of surrogacy for designer babies actually range from $20,000 to $120,000 at this point, and the cost of modified eggs are up to $50,000. So yet again, not everybody can pay that money, obviously, and a small minority can. And so that further on addresses the first point of lack of diversity and outcast of society for people who cannot pay for these advancements will be outcasted by the wealthy elite. Lastly, there is ultimately thin medical justification on the topic for genetic engineering. According to a study done by geneticsandSociety.org, they claim that there is too much uncertainty and that we already have methods to preventing transmission of inherited diseases without manipulating genes. Furthermore, even with the latest gene editing tools, off-target and unintended effects are still an unsolved problem. Even Stephen Hawking quoted that we are about 2 decades away from even genetic engineering being truly affected due to the time it takes for DNA to advance and evolutionize. So overall, those are our 3 points, and now we'll move to the main argument for the against team. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate what a very concise argument, so well referenced. Very well done. Congratulations. Now we're going to move to Thomas Gozek, commonly known as the Scars. He is going to present the main argument for the blue against team.
Yep. Thank you very much, Mr. Norris. So for our argument, we're really against the progression of um, basically limiting genetic engineering. And there's so many reasons behind this. It's really the future of society. Um, the existence of genetic engineering has come about a result of human evolution and knowledge and intellect, but it can go beyond what we see in terms of developing a baby and playing God and being able to develop their intelligence and their superiority in society. It can also benefit us in terms of helping with food and diseases, which is something that wipes out and kills people in large numbers every year. So basically, there's so many benefits behind it. I'm going to focus on basically how can genetic engineering play a massive role in food production and food enhancements, as well as how can it play a benefit in eradicating diseases that sit in genetic information. So first, before I hop into the food production, we have to focus on a grim fact. Experts say that by 2050, food production will need to be increased in order to nourish the approximately 9 billion people that are expected to be inhabiting Earth in 2050. This was published by the University of Minnesota School of Agriculture. And they don't even account for the fact that over 1 billion people today, whether you're accounting for the pandemic that we're going through right now or in every day, because this was published in 2019, over 1 billion people in today's world struggle with malnourishment, whether it be because of access to food or economic status. Now, how can genetic engineering really help with this? Well, genetic engineering of crops and livestock will allow for there to be more production, and really these materials that, whether you're growing them in your backyard or on a large farm, they can be enhanced to have more nutritional value. You can also enhance them to make sure that they reproduce at a higher rate, at a faster rate, or if it's something in terms of apples or rice or potatoes, you can have hybrids that can grow in more extreme conditions, grow at faster rates, and this way you could have larger fields that can grow much faster, and you could pick them up and send them off to stores that can be allowing for people to get food. When we're facing something like this, where in 2050 we're going to have lack of food globally because of the way that our population is increasing, that's when the problems come in. And in terms of how we do this, well, Brian McGinn talked before about CRISPR and its counterparts. There's different ways that we can genetically modify the genes of these foods and livestock by taking out and inserting parts of their genetic information to make sure that they hold more nutritional value, which is also talked about by the FDA in terms of how can we get the most calories into our body so that we can have energy and have a proper diet. And now in terms of human benefits, again, I'm going to attack this in the same way that I attacked food. We have to focus on the fact that is horrible and it affects the world every single year. Approximately 10 million people will die from cancer on an annual basis, approximately. And as of 2018, ever since HIV and AIDS has been studied since the 1980s, around 770,000 people have died from HIV and AIDS. And that's a large amount, and it's only going to go up if we aren't able to treat it. There's new treatments that have came out to basically make it zero detectable. But if we could use genetic engineering, we could literally go into a parent or into the genetic information of a child who was just conceived, and we could remove the gene that holds the genetic information that's related to HIV and AIDS. So that this way it cannot be spread beyond how it already has affected the child and the parents, which has already killed over 700,000 people in the world, which is a very large number. And it goes beyond HIV, AIDS, and cancers. People die from syndromes that are passed on genetically. at such a large number per year. There's so many studies. We were watching a study, a talk at 12 from Harvard University, and he was talking about how there's so many. He went from A through H in terms of talking about what corresponds with each letter and how genetic engineering can really benefit each of these different things, whether it be cancers, genetic information that's passed on from your parents that could affect you, can make you be wheelchair bound, can make you have problems in terms of accessibility to the world. And by using genetic engineering, it really benefit the world in terms of making it a better place, making it a safer place, and making it a place where everyone can be happier and live a much better life. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you, and well done once again. Good research and good reference. That brings to a close both main arguments from both teams, and thank you for bringing these arguments. Just to remind everybody, the blue team is against limiting the restriction or limiting genetic engineering. In other words, putting restrictions and so forth, whereas the maroon team is for the limitation. As teams are currently working up their arguments, I just want to remind you that, if we look at races from the past, if you think about the space race, you think about the race for the human genome, these were both races which had little or to very, very little restrictions placed on them. And so the question really keeps on coming up is, well, if we limit things, will we move as fast? I want to use one example. If you look at the current situation, how technology and the technology used together with e-learning has accelerated so much because of a need. So put that out there so that you can, mull that through as they complete their arguments. And with that in mind, I'm going to open now to Donovan Wu, who is going to complete the rebuttal for the maroon team, the 4 team. So take it away, Donovan.
All right. So the reason being for that limits have to exist for genetic engineering, we'll go in the order of where the arguments went. So for food can be produced in mass productions and gain more nutrients, but with a lot of genetic engineering, if we don't have the limits of removing micronutrients for small organisms that need the plant's nutrients to survive, we can ruin the ecosystem that way. And with plants need more pesticides and other chemicals because we're having to remove the antibiotic resistances with each plant. So, for example, like corn, we have to use more pesticides with corn because we started using pesticides with corn, and what happens is it genetically modified the corn to prevent it from communicating with other plants, which now lots of the corn, since it can't communicate with each other, we have to keep using pesticides, and that's bad for the plants. And for diseases, we don't know all the effects it could bring other than getting rid of genetic disorders. Genetic disorders, we could be removing the genetic disorder by adding another problem. There's still many reasons. There's still many drawbacks we can't predict about those. And for humans, when we genetically modify humans, if we do not add the limits of creating our own children and like making them how we want them to be, those are called designer babies. So with the designer babies, they're more like robots because you're not giving it its own, you're changing its personality, its appearance to what is good, what you think is good, which doesn't give us the diverse qualities of everyone. And so with that, also many of our children lack creativity because creativity has to do with all different types of people thinking of different things. But if we genetically modify babies into like set intelligences, appearances, they won't have the creativity and be more like one narrow path when thinking. So, and let's see. And those are the main reasons that we have to limit. Yes. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Donovan. I'm sure you'll have something more as the arguments start coming through from the audience as well. I'm going to turn over to Sal Genovese now, who will complete the blue team's against argument, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So, and just a reminder, when you open up to the floor, just to post your comments or post your questions directly into the chat, and we'll direct them to the various members of each team.
Hi. I'd like to start by saying that there's this false notion that with genetic modification, you have to just completely change everything possible. So even though there won't be limits, so say you give me the ability to modify a baby to however I please, and you say there's no limitations to me, that doesn't mean I have to go and modify everything to just create some new master robot thing creation. What you do with the limitations, it prevents you from advancing and keep finding better solutions to the problem that we are trying to address. For example, it was said about the designer babies creating this perfect baby with all these like great looks and everything, and earlier mentioned on by Chris that you can make this smarter baby by modifying his genes. Well, it's not unfavorable to be smart. So I would say that's a trait that's great to advance to develop our human race. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. And you don't have to necessarily just create a designer baby. Like you can develop the parts that need to develop with the human race, become smarter and more intelligent and continue to have advancements that are beneficial, even without limitations, without going into just making anything you want. And then also with the point of playing God in this, we can't say that it's not a gift from God, this ability to genetically modify organisms. For example, we are faced with famine and poverty all throughout history, and now we have the solution to put an end to that. The same way if you look at scripture where in the past God provided a way through a symbolic stuff such as like sending down angels or whatnot to provide people with a way out, like when he freed the Israelites from Egypt and that whole story. That's mostly symbolism, and it's trying to give a point that God will provide. And we can't necessarily dismiss this as saying, oh, we're going to be playing God, because this might just actually be the solution from God in regards to that argument. And so with also the point about uniqueness with genetic variation, it does, curing a disease doesn't necessarily take away genetic variation. So say, for example, a child is going to have a genetic disorder such as Down syndrome. You can fix that problem and still leave the baby with all its other unique character traits, which is something great because now you can take away one other factor that can shorten its life or bring harm to this child, and you still keep its uniqueness. So with curing the disease, you do not have to take away genetic variation, and we can have this normalized if there is no limitations. Because when a lot of limitations in place, it seems like something taboo, but if there's not all these limitations, we can normalize it into life. Like say the creation of iPhones or electric cars years ago would have been inconceivable as an idea. If I time traveled back in time and said you would have this all-powerful device with this search engine called Google just in your back pocket, you'd probably call me crazy. But now everyone has an iPhone or Android or some sort in their pocket. So with genetic variation, with genetic modification, if we can turn this into something that's a normal routine of curing diseases and creating a better world, I wouldn't see why we'd want to say no to that.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Sal. Are you done?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, if there are any counter arguments from either team of speakers, you can put that forward right now. Otherwise, I'm going to open up to the floor. And so I'd ask if you do have a question, just to write a brief, you're welcome to speak in the question, just to put your name down in the chat session, and I will call on you individually if you have a question. So just put there your name and question for the maroon team or question for the blue team, against or for, whatever the case may be. I do want to bring up a question, and this is a question maybe for both teams. The first one is this. With regards to genetic engineering, and if we were to not restrict it, if we weren't to not limit genetic engineering, the first question I have is, with the amount of change that could happen, okay, if that was to happen, what would, if we were to allow it to continue, and maybe a good percentage of the similar characteristics were taken out of our human genome, what would that do to our relative frequency? By that I mean our genetic frequency of certain traits. Would we then possibly lose a certain trait completely out of our whole human genome? So that my question might really be to the against team. So anybody from the against team want to answer that? Brian or Tom or Sel? Sel is still there. Can't see you, Sel or Thomas Skozek or Brian McGinn. One of you want to answer that question? Yeah, like what would, if we were to take out, because I've agreed to get a more perfect baby, that's going to affect the frequencies of our genetic frequencies. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that? Thomas, you got an answer for me, perhaps?
Sorry, it kicked me out. I didn't see the question. I didn't hear it.
It's my question directly from me, actually. If we were to start playing with, even just to like modify different traits, and here we're talking about just desirable traits, would we then in turn change the relative frequencies within our whole genome, so that eventually a trait, I don't know, like unibrows, let's just say, that might just disappear completely? Not that that's desirable, but
yeah. So the whole thing that if you were to start removing desirable traits, you're right. It's very possible that you could start messing with the relative frequencies in terms of how often a unibrow shows up, how often traits like hair color, in terms of eye color, stuff like that can become less common or more common depending on what you're inserting into the DNA. So in terms of enhancing that, yes, but in most cases, if you pose to a parent who's having a child the idea of genetic engineering, in terms of being a parent, in terms of being a good parent and wanting to have the best for your child, typically the most common thing that would want to be genetically modified would be the idea of having the ability to cut out a gene that has traces of having various cancers, diseases, and stuff that would be harmful to their child. Before we even talk about playing this idea of God and modifying eye color and stuff like that, because yes, that would in turn mess up the relative frequencies of what comes up in the human population.
Okay, good. Thank you, Tom. That's I mean, obviously those are what would normally be the case, but one has to question where it goes. I'll come back to another question. I have. It seems that everybody's got a question for the against team. So those guys on that team, I need you to look at the questions that are in the chat. Matthew Forges, you have a question for the blue team. I'm going to put you on. You can have a go and just word your question whilst they're looking at. There's a question from Mr. Rizlowski as well with regards to how do we reconcile the fact that all, even the handicapped and those with genetic disorders, are created in the image and likeness of God? These issues are fundamentally different than, say, cancer. That's a very good point. Doesn't it seem problematic to say we know better than God? Oh, nice one. Very good. Matt Forges, do you want to give your question as well?
Sure. For the against team, how can you assure us that uncontrolled scientific research will not result in a similar fashion to the scientific research of Germany in the 1930s and 40s, which resulted in thousands of casualties, innocent lives being taken by uncontrolled scientific experiments?
Okay, also just looking back at history, another good question. Certainly something. I think the gains team are going to have to step up their game a little bit. Let's see if we have a question for the other team. Mr. Rathman Brown, unrestricted genetic engineering scenario. Fruits go soggy when frozen because the large ice crystals break cell walls. So I said about producing a recombinant bacteria that releases a protein that reduces the temperature that water freezes in size of ice crystals. Success, solid, non-sloppy frozen fruit. But the bacteria hit the ice caps. Oh, hit the clouds and the world suffers immeasurably. Okay. The question, Mr. Rathman Brown, you want to jump on and ask that question, and who's it to?
So, to either really, one, I think if we restrict the progress, we're going to slow it down.
Correct.
Next, is there a problem with slowing it down? When you consider something as devastating as that bacteria could possibly be, where all of a sudden it's completely out of control. So if nobody's say, I have the idea, I'm going to do this, I'm going to stop fruit being sloppy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really good, honourable cause. But then the knock-on effect is we absolutely devastate the climate in an unbelievable way because nobody's looking at the bigger picture. So, how are we going to prevent scenarios like that occurring where the knock-on effect is so unpredictable? If you're thinking about it from a one person, one aim point of view, it's inevitably going to end up with like a cane toad problem in Australia type style thing.
Correct.
So how, if we're not going to have any restrictions on it, are we going to prevent literally the inevitable scenario of one of those things occurring?
Well, I think we need to be careful about when we say restrictions and regulations.
Right.
Now, restriction says, well, we can't go any further than this level, and regulation says, hey, we're just going to check to see that your work is good. We just check, and that kind of brings us to what science does. So I didn't want to get into sort of, hey, we need a universal organization because, well, I needn't go into that right now. But, I see your point. If we limit or regulate, that's a touchy question. The against team, do you have an answer for Mr. Roslowski's question?
Yeah, sure, I can answer that. So, about the question of us all having that being created in like the image of likeness of God, I totally agree with that, which is why we view that, at least Catholics and people who are interested in like the religious question of this dilemma, those people with Down syndrome or other disorders, they're just as equal in human dignity as us. But the question isn't necessarily to say that we have to fix them or say that there's something wrong with their dignity is to just relieve a hardship that may not allow them to do a lot of things or live as long as a life as anyone else, which the goal is really to just provide them with that opportunity to do some things that they aren't able to do. And so in this case, we aren't taking away their dignity. We're just enabling them to do more. So that's really the goal there, because we don't know that God necessarily wants them to have any suffering and hardships in life. We can argue to say that God wants us to use this new tool that we found as humans to help relieve ourselves of this form of suffering.
Okay. Fair enough.
Mr. Norris, can I jump in?
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us.
My thanks to all you guys and all the folks who are on here, and Mr. Norris for organizing this and for the invitation. And so this is a conundrum, and I hate to put you on the spot, right? You're just the guy who was bold enough to answer. I think, and that shouldn't be punished. So I'm not. No. Really, I think the intellectual engagement here, and I think this is the challenge. Part of what, and I would certainly be arguing for restrictions, right? Just so my bias or my position here is clear. I think one thing that concerns me, and this goes a little bit maybe to the previous question going back to Nazi Germany and things, is sort of who's deciding, right? Who makes those decisions that, well, this is the better life? So let me take a different example than we were looking at. At one point it came up, would we want to make people smarter? Okay, and I say this lovingly, right? But would we want the world to be like Regis kids, or would we want the world to be like Xavier kids? Now, I think the world's pretty good with both kids, right? But by one measure, they're smarter than the kids at a lot of other schools, right? By one measure, right? I've spent lots of time with those guys, and so have you guys, right? They're great kids, right? But I wouldn't trade one of our weaker students for one of their better kids because of the difference in gifts, right? And what are the trade-offs? So I think that's part of the complication for me, right? Who's deciding and what do we recognize, right? One thing that's suffering now or difficulty now may bring great pluses, right? Or our understanding may be limited. And this kind of assumes that our understanding is not limited. So the decisions we make now, we know will be right. That's part of my concern.
Yeah, that's a valid concern, Mr. Wislarski, and it is the value of what is the value and who makes those decisions, and that is part of the limiting as well. So good reason for concern. Anybody want other team? You want to opt in there?
I mean, I can further respond to that angle. So
sure.
In regards to what Mr. Norris said before about restrictions versus regulations, so we're arguing that there shouldn't be limits in the sense that anything can be possible if there's a way to solve some sort of ailment to the human race, like anything that can harm us and our development, that to be open to that route. However, there should be regulations in the sense that an organization or a group of people checking in just to make sure that it doesn't violate basic human rights. So in that sense, if we had something like that, it would prevent another Holocaust from happening, or something of having a crazy leader who thinks that one group of people is better than another, or if you're disabled, anything like that. We'd have to have an organization of people of different backgrounds who come together to check on the scientific community just to make sure that human rights aren't being violated, whether it's from a religious standpoint or even if you're atheist, you would still have a moral code of believing that everyone is equal, just as being human beings. So in that sense, there shouldn't be limitations to what we should do, just people making sure that we don't do the wrong thing.
Good. Question for the blue team. Sorry, the maroon team. I have from Mr. Rosen Brown as well. How could restrictions be enforced? Would USA not lose advantage over frontline research? Good. That's a good question for the 14 as well. I'll come back to that as well, but also to ask this question for the 14 is, with limiting, we had a situation for 8 years where genetic engineering was limited based on religious preferences. Now, I won't go into the politics of that, but it did slow us down. Genetic engineering's been around since the 80s. Imagine if we weren't limited for those 8 years where we possibly could have been now. Having said that, part of that limitation forced genetic engineering to go a different path, which, also looked into different things. For the 14, those two questions, anybody want to have a go at that? Donovan? Chris? Oliver?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a crack at it. Okay.
Chris,
sorry.
have a go first. You go ahead.
All right. So I'll try to knock out both. For Mr. Ratham's question, that's a good question. I would assume they would have to be, the restrictions would have to be administered federally, and losing advantage is obviously a concern with the bigger picture. However, certain countries, I wouldn't say it's losing an advantage. Certain countries are already limiting restrictions as well. So back in 2018, actually, a scientist from China actually tried creating a genetically modified baby, and the government actually ended up shutting down the whole program because of the backlashes after his study, and they concluded it as an immoral effect. So, but to outline the whole thing, it's obviously a good question, but there's no country that's, I would say, more advanced than the other right now in this stage because of how early we are in practicing this. And Mr. Norris, what was your question again?
My question, I think, was, it was more of a statement than a question, but for 8 years between 2000 and 2008, a lot of genetic engineering was stymied because of stem cell objections. How do you account for that sort of thing when there is an objection based on something totally not scientific, but some other, interruption, call it that. That might have put us as a country back considerably in terms of our progression or leadership in that field of genetic engineering.
All right. So again,
do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah. So are you saying like something like stem cells worked well for us, so we shouldn't limit?
Well, up until 2000, stem cell research was allowed, and then the administration at the time and the government at the time turned around and banned stem cell research. We were on the brink. We had just discovered the human genome. We were on the brink of doing good things, and then that obviously changed. That kind of is what the limit I'm talking about. That's an example of a limit which was imposed, which slowed down the race of the genetic engineering race.
Okay, so I think the problem with unlimiting genetic engineering, aside from stem cell research on this topic, is that going back to the cost and affecting multiple individuals more directly. Mm-hmm. So obviously, again, the making this affordable and likely for anybody to do so is frankly just unrealistic and won't happen. And it has more what people who are for unlimiting it has more drastic changes than I think for stem cell research. So I think that's my team and I's opinion, if that answers your statement, kind of.
Yeah, I mean it does to a certain way.
Okay.
A question from Massimo Prague. Massimo says, what about countries that really don't care about human rights, like North Korea or China? That would be to the Maroon team again, if I'm correct, Massimo.
So I think I might have a response to that. So
Sure.
into how this would be like on what level this type of science would be regulated. I think that because it calls into question like the human race in general and application to various levels of society. I think that it should also be the regulation should be rooted in some sort of international um, group.
Mhm.
And so
Like the World Health Organization,
when
that sort of thing.
when right, yeah. So yeah, exactly. And so when you have countries like North Korea that are definitely very questionable in the way in which they treat their citizens, um, I think that within an international sort of like context in a group such as the world, such as a organization that deals with the world's health, um, you you account for you reach a consensus, a general consensus, and sort of account for countries that regard their citizens in that way. Whether that might entail like preventing them from even joining the organization, or just like restricting them further, or being more guarded and cognizant of the way that they employ that sort of research in their own country, if that makes sense.
Sure, fair enough. Question from Julian Mongi Adlerberger. I think this would be for the against team, if I'm correct. Julian, your question is, if diseases were to cured and eradicated due to genetic engineering, wouldn't this allow the populations to grow larger than it already is, which gives way to possibilities of new diseases? Basically, it's saying like overpopulation is a problem. Am I getting that correct, Julian? Yeah. Okay. Well, that would be to the against team, the blue team. Anybody care to answer there? Go ahead, Tom.
Could I take?
Yeah.
Yep. So I'm gonna could I go hand in hand with this question and the concern that Matthew Ford just had before as well?
Absolutely. Go ahead. That's great that we're getting all these questions.
So Matthew Ford just was concerned with like the 1930s and 1940s with the Nazis and the way that they were so against anyone that wasn't of the non-Aryan race.
Yeah.
I'm Polish. I went to the Schindler's Factory in Poland. I've seen Auschwitz. I know exactly the type of persecution that was going against anyone that didn't have blonde hair, blue eyes, was a Jew, or was of non-Aryan descent. They were persecuted. They were put in gas chambers. They were sent to concentration camps to do work. And he wanted the world to be of pure Aryan race. Now, in terms of his concerns of wouldn't we have a similar situation where if you weren't of genetic engineering, could we see a possible decline of that population? Well, what our concern is, we don't want restriction. We're on the side of some regulation, but we want to be able to enhance this. We wouldn't hop in straight away in terms of making sure everyone gets this done right away, and then maybe there's some problems along the way, but don't worry about them. We want to make sure that we perfect this and we're able to be at least able to perfect it before we can go ahead and enforcing it and using on the population, so that we can make this world a better place, and that this way everyone can live a more better life, have a longer longevity of life. And that goes hand in hand with the question that was just asked of when the world's like population grow, and it certainly will, and that would lead to overpopulation. But like I said before, by 2050 we're projected to already reach 9 billion people on Earth. We're around 7 billion right now, and overpopulation can lead to, like I addressed before, food shortages, and it could lead to more people being condensed in smaller places, and resulting in we already live in one of the most condensed environments in the world, which is New York City, but that can also spread across the world. Now the whole thing that would go hand in hand with it, we can't just make sure that we genetically engineer people so that they can live longer lives and live better lives. It would need to go hand in hand with being able to genetically engineer food as well, to make it more nutritional value, to make sure that we have good diets, which would lead to a better immune system, which would lead to us living, even if it's a high population, we're concerned with people living longer, better lives. So if we're able to enhance a person's genetics, we need to be able also to enhance food's genetics to make sure that everyone has a good diet.
Yeah, good call. Tom, I'll bring up this question, though. And I see Mr. Roslowski turned his chair, but I think you're going to enjoy this question because here's the conundrum.
I turn back. I like seeing Oliver's smiling face.
Well, I have. This is one that really hits the problem here, and I think I brought this to your attention in a video that I sent to my AP boys. Say we don't limit genetic engineering. Say we make it great, and we really we cure the world's illnesses. We create enough food, and we do all these good things. Are we making these available to everybody? Is the ability to genetically engineer, that availability, is that to everybody? Because if we start having select pickings of things, and we say, oh, we want that type of a look, and we're going to change this crop, well, that's going to make it better for that farmer. Are we making this genetic engineering available to everybody across the board? That's actually the bigger ethical question here.
Yeah. So I think Chris Cagliuso addressed it before in terms of cost effectiveness. He addressed it, and right now, to genetically modify a person's DNA, it's between $20,000 to $120,000, and that's a lot of money, and it absolutely is not available to a large amount of people. Most people aren't going to spend $20,000 to $120,000 to perfect or to enhance their child's DNA. That's only really available to the top 1% or the top 5% of the world's population. However, I think we don't fully know yet, because the problem is it's only been going on for so long. We're still in the process of perfecting the idea of genetic modification. But if it keeps going and keeps getting perfected and keeps becoming a staple in society, you're going to see a constant decline of price effectiveness, because it's going to be such typical and so usual that you're probably going to see the decline of the cost as well. So it should be able to be reached out to more people.
We presume that might be the case.
Yes.
We hope in the idea of like technology, like a computer must have cost thousands of dollars early on, and now it's virtually nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
We hope that would be the case. Okay, fair enough. There's a couple of questions here by a couple of my freshmen, Mike McGrill, Matthew Lane, and Ryan Dorian. I think it goes towards the same sort of question, and maybe this is a concern, and I'll open this up to everybody. Ryan says, if I have a question that's on my mind, if genetic engineered kids go to school with kids like us who aren't genetically engineered, is there an emotional toll that those kids may go through? Like if people knew that those kids were produced differently, could that cause emotional problems for that kid? That's a concern, obviously, you're saying for any genetic modification. So, and then Mike McGrill says, like, I've seen that genetic engineering can lead to countries genetically engineering people to make what they call super armies. This can lead to more wars, mass destruction. How is this supposed to be limited? I mean, that's a really huge statement. I think, as you've just intimated, like, be on the forefront of genetic modification. And I guess both of them are saying, hey, if we don't limit this in some respect, this could get out of hand. So, I guess you kind of answered that question. Massimo, you said to Ryan, not just to kids, but to everyone. This difference in people might cause segregation or social outcasts. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Finian, you said, considering limitations on genetic engineering, couldn't a non-limited source of genetic engineering help us in these times of pandemic crisis today? Could the coronavirus have been a thing of the past by now? Wow. Well, that would be for anybody in the Maroon team, I guess. Anybody want to try and answer that in the Maroon team? I think we'll by the way, just so we can keep this limited, I'm gonna tap off at 2:15. I think 2:15. I think we must limit this. So if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll carry on from there. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So to kind of answer everybody, including the freshmen and Finn, and also Anthony Bruno asked a question about, there are so many benefits scientifically with diseases and pandemics and all that, obviously. And once again, I want to reemphasize in our introduction that our team and I acknowledge the various benefits that this could have against deadly diseases and cancers and so on. But our main concern as a team is unlimiting it. And what the freshmen emphasize in the comments is more of a societal factor about, editing people and, the designer babies and all that stuff. So the coronavirus stuff is definitely a good idea. So I think our team can agree on that there should be a limitation where we can't start, there can't be an unlimited regulation for people, because once it moves into the societal factor, then you see in the comments lack of diversity, more disparities between the rich and the poor, all that societal stuff, not diseases necessarily. So that's our team's main concern. We're not totally against the idea. Obviously, it could have great benefits, but we're more concerned about how this will affect each human individually, because obviously we think it could get out of hand, because people who can afford it and have the resources will try it out. Obviously, there's no stopping that. So I think that's where we stand. I think Finn's point is very good. And I think the main question is, how do we solely keep it to cancers and disease and not out-proportionalize it with, doing whatever we want with people? So I think that's where we stand.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm just going to go run up quickly in case I missed something. Anthony Bruno, based on extensive research, genetic has been proven to prevent many badly diseases. How can you justify? How can you justify not allowing genetic engineering to save people from suffering? Well, I think that was the answer pretty much. Okay, so I'm gonna presume we don't have any other who wins, Matt. I'm gonna actually throw that out to some of the teachers. Some good argument on both sides, and I think I know Blue, you had most of the questions put to you, and most of your answers were pretty good. As you can see, this is not one of those things that one of these topics that can be easily answered. I think the bigger questions that we have to consider are the ethics part of it, and the availability and how far we go, whether it's just for medical, for agricultural, for the human species. I think we'll keep this debate going as the years go on, and until we get something more substantial and answers get a bit better. But one of the biggest things that have dawned on me in this debate, and as I said, I'll leave it open for a few more minutes, is this little conundrum. And we see it in our present day situation. A selfishness. I think if one were to use genetic engineering for one's own good and for one's own means, this could be a problem. When we start using genetic engineering for the whole of humanity, with that thought in mind, in other words, as somebody said, if we were to, Mr. Rathman Brown's example, well, yes, I like my fruit not soggy, but I also like my world to be have polar ice caps. When one only thinks about themselves, then one doesn't see the whole picture. When we start to see our world as living with each other, then maybe this genetic engineering debate can continue. Maybe this genetic engineering can continue in a good way. So this is, I think, a lesson for us all. And I think right now what we're going through is so important, because keeping us isolated helps the larger community. Yes, it hurts us right now. I miss you guys so much. I miss the school. I miss my colleagues. I miss you guys. I miss being in front of that classroom and just having a great day. But in the bigger picture, I love you guys that much that I don't want to make you sick. And I don't want to make your family sick. So I think, genetic engineering has the same principle. If we think about the greater community and the whole earth, then I think we will have a much better progression on this. If there are no more questions, if there are no more comments, I thank you all for attending. Freshman, you have a short task to write for me for this afternoon's assignment. And AP guys, thank you very much for all your hard work. Thank you everybody for attending. I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing you all at Xavier. Good afternoon.
Thanks, Greg.
Oh, pleasure, Mr. Osowski. I appreciate you being online. It's I'm sure we could have had some nice things in there. Thank you for bringing the ethics part in. I'm more concerned about that sort of thing, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's the and again, I think part of that is a bit of the wealth of life experience. But good to have folks in the mix of all this.
I wonder if we could have other topics that could be debated like this.
You also had my guess is you roped in your freshmen, but you had a great crowd here.
Yeah, I did. I brought them in for I didn't know how to host it, because we limited to 250, so I couldn't put it out to the whole community, because then I might have crashed the thing. So I'm going to post the recorded version online for everybody to see. Mm-hmm. My freshmen had to come online. I didn't get all of them, I'm sure. But at least I should say to them I'd post the recorded version when I complete it here, and so that they can watch it later. And I'll do the same to the staff as well. So.
Good.
Okay.
Good. Thanks, Greg.
Okay. Pleasure. Bye-bye. Ethan Donovan, you still there?
Hello?
Hey, Don.
Yeah, I couldn't answer many because like I have a little sister and a little cousin, and they're screaming like crazy.
It's okay. Don't stress. I was surprised. Yeah, I was surprised. I was surprised at your arguments. I thought you would have been a little bit stronger. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah.
There was a lot of confusion between like limiting and like not having genetic engineering.
Well, that's like. Well, I wanted to say limiting rather than regulating, because I think we can all agree that regulating is a necessity.
Yes.
Regulating means checking But to say like we are not going in that direction, but we are going in that direction, I don't know about that. I'm now going to take the opposite view and say, well, why would we want to completely limit everything just for the sake of like being scared? Somebody must have said, oh, we're never going to get off this planet and go to the moon. No, that's absolutely crazy. Yet somebody turned around and said, well, why not? I'm surprised we didn't go that way.
Yeah.
I'm surprised they didn't even go down to that level. They kind of, the against team are kind of like, oh, it's okay to regulate because no, let's go. It's called a race because we want to, make money and get there and get there and get there. And who knows what we can do. But I was surprised. I was hoping they would go that way, but it didn't look like it. Anyway, I think it's easy to turn around and say, yes, let's regulate, let's limit, because you never know where it's going to go. That's hesitancy. That's part of me wants to say, like, you can't be that hesitant, otherwise we'll never get anywhere. If I say to my kids, don't swing on the monkey ropes because you'll fall, well, they'll never swing. But if I say go, like, try. And then regulate as you go along. So like say go for it, and then we'll look at it afterwards and consider.
They gotta like have some kind of experience to it, as
in
well,
terms of the children. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you add the like kind of rules to some certain rules to help for the like so you can get the good and then remove the bad.
Correct. That's my sort of debate inside myself. I'm always about, well, let's try. Let's see where we can go, rather than saying, no, you can't go down that road. Well, what happens if that road leads us to much greater things?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Anyway. Well, thank you, Donovan, for at least being around and for giving your part. I'll get some feedback from some other teachers, so in terms of best speaker and winning team, etc., etc.
Okay.
Okay.
All right,
my man. We're moving to evolution on Thursday.
Okay.
All right. Fresh content. All right. Thanks, man. All right,
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Matt Smith. Hey, Steve, you still there?